If your child ever calls a stranger dad, don't turn around, because it might be the man who broke you. Ethan thought, but he turned anyway, and everything inside him stopped as if the world itself had missed a heartbeat, because standing just 10 feet away, framed by the soft morning light spilling through the daycare windows, was Lucas Hale, exactly as he remembered, and yet sharper, colder, like time had carved him into something harder to forget. Ethan's fingers tightened instinctively around Noah's small hand, feeling the warmth, the tiny pulse, grounding himself in the present while his mind threatened to drag him back 3 years in a single violent rush of memory, the echo of a voice, the press of a moment that had changed everything. But he shoved it down, forcing air into his lungs, slow, controlled, because Noah was still there, still real, still looking up at the stranger with wide gray-blue eyes that mirrored too much. And then it happened, the words slipping out soft and curious, "Dad?" And Ethan felt it physically, like something twisting deep in his chest, sharp and sudden, his breath catching as Lucas's gaze snapped to the boy, locking onto him with an intensity that was almost unbearable to watch, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed, his jaw tightening, shoulders going still, every inch of him going quiet in that dangerous, controlled way Ethan remembered too well. "Noah," Ethan said quickly, voice tighter than he wanted, crouching slightly, brushing his thumb over the back of his son's hand. A small, grounding motion. "We don't." But the words faltered, because Lucas had already taken a step closer, and it wasn't aggressive, not loud, just deliberate, like gravity pulling him forward, his eyes never leaving the child, scanning, noticing, the color, the shape, the tiny details that shouldn't matter and yet did, and Ethan could feel it, that shift in the air, that almost invisible click as something inside Lucas started connecting dots that were never meant to be seen. "How old is he?" Lucas asked, voice low, steady, but there was something underneath it now, something rougher, something that scraped against Ethan's nerves, and Ethan swallowed, the answer sitting heavy on his tongue. 3 years, 3 long years of sleepless nights and quiet victories and whispered reassurances in the dark. But he didn't say it, couldn't say it, because saying it would make it real in a way that couldn't be undone. "Old enough," he replied instead. The words clipped, controlled, and Lucas's eyes flickered, just for a second, like he heard everything Ethan didn't say, like he understood anyway, and the silence stretched between them, thick, fragile, until a voice from across the room cut through it with careless ease. "Hey, that kid looks just like you." And the world tilted, just slightly, just enough for Ethan to feel it, that subtle shift where everything begins to fall apart, because Lucas went completely still, his expression emptying out for a fraction of a second before something darker slid into place, something sharper, more focused, his gaze dropping back to Noah, slower this time, more deliberate, tracing the familiar lines, the unmistakable similarities, and when he looked back at Ethan, there was no hesitation left, only a quiet, dangerous certainty. "Is he mine?" he asked, and Ethan's throat closed, the past finally breaking through in fragments he couldn't hold back anymore. Heat and fear and a night that had never really ended, and for the first time in 3 years, he realized there was no running from this. Not anymore. The question hung between them, heavy and unmovable, and Ethan could feel it pressing against his chest, tightening with every second Lucas waited for an answer, those sharp gray-blue eyes refusing to look away, refusing to let him hide behind silence the way he had for 3 years. Noah shifted beside him, small fingers tugging lightly at Ethan's sleeve, unaware of the storm building inches above his head. And that simple touch nearly broke Ethan's composure, because this was his life now. Fragile and hard-won, built piece by piece from nights that stretched too long and mornings that came too soon, and Lucas did not get to walk back into it like he still belonged. "No," Ethan said finally, the word quiet but firm, and he hated how his voice betrayed him. Just slightly, how it trembled at the edges, because Lucas caught it instantly, something in his expression tightening, not anger, not yet, but recognition, like he could hear the truth buried underneath the denial. "You are lying," Lucas replied, just as calm, just as controlled, but there was weight behind it now, something that made the air feel thinner, and Ethan forced himself to straighten, lifting his chin, meeting that gaze head-on even as his pulse pounded unevenly in his throat. You do not get to decide what is true for me. He shot back, sharper than before, because if he let even a crack show, Lucas would see everything, and he could not afford that. Not here, not in front of Noah, not when the past was already clawing its way back into the present without permission. Lucas exhaled slowly, a measured breath that did nothing to soften the tension, his attention drifting back to Noah again. And this time it lingered even longer, tracing the familiar lines with a quiet intensity that made Ethan's stomach twist, because it was not just curiosity anymore. It was certainty growing, solidifying, and Ethan knew that look, knew the moment Lucas decided something mattered, because he never let it go after that. What is his name? Lucas asked, softer now, but somehow more dangerous, and Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before answering. Noah. And the way Lucas repeated it under his breath, like he was testing how it felt, made something cold slide down Ethan's spine. Noah, meanwhile, tilted his head, studying Lucas with open curiosity, completely unguarded, and then he smiled, small and bright, the kind of smile that had carried Ethan through the hardest days. You look like me, Noah said matter-of-factly, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else, because Lucas actually froze, his composure slipping for the first time. Just a flicker, just enough to show the impact, his hand flexing at his side like he did not know what to do with it, like he was resisting the instinct to reach out. Ethan saw it, and panic flared sharp in his chest, immediate and overwhelming, because that instinct meant attachment. And attachment meant complication, and complication meant everything he had worked to keep stable could fall apart. We should go, Ethan said quickly, already turning, already pulling Noah gently toward the door, because distance was the only thing he had left, the only control he could still hold on to. But Lucas moved faster, stepping into his path, not blocking aggressively, just enough to make Ethan stop, their proximity suddenly too close, too familiar, the faint scent of him stirring memories Ethan had buried. Deep. Ethan, Lucas said, and hearing his name like that, steady and certain, sent a sharp, unwanted ache through him. If he is mine, you do not get to walk away again. And Ethan's breath hitched, anger rising fast to cover the fear. You already walked away once, he snapped, the words cutting clean, and for the first time, Lucas's expression cracked fully, something raw flashing through his eyes before he could hide it. I told you, Lucas said, voice lower now, rougher. I did not leave. You. And the way he said it, like it mattered, like it changed anything, made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he did not want to examine. Because if that was true, then everything he had believed for 3 years might not be as simple as he needed it to be. Lucas's words did not fade. They settled, heavy and stubborn, looping in Ethan's mind in a way that made it hard to breathe, because there was something different in his tone this time, something that did not match the memory Ethan had clung to for 3 years, and that inconsistency was more dangerous than anything else. Noah shifted again, glancing between them with quiet curiosity, his small brow furrowing as if he could sense the tension even if he could not understand it, and then he reached out without hesitation, tiny fingers brushing against Lucas's sleeve in a simple, innocent gesture that froze both men in place. Lucas looked down immediately, his entire focus narrowing to that small point of contact, his hand lifting slightly before stopping midair, like he was unsure whether he was allowed to close the distance, and that hesitation, that restraint, struck Ethan harder than anger ever could. Because this was not the man who had once overwhelmed every space he stepped into. This was someone holding back, calculating every movement like it mattered. Hi, Noah said softly, completely at ease, offering a small, open smile that had always disarmed strangers, but this time it landed differently, because Lucas's expression shifted in response, something unguarded slipping through, something almost fragile as he lowered himself slightly to meet Noah at eye level, careful, deliberate, like he was approaching something he did not want to break. Hi, Lucas replied, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and Ethan felt a sharp, confusing pull in his chest, watching the moment unfold in a way he had never allowed himself to imagine. Are you my dad? Noah asked, the question simple, direct, and completely devastating in its honesty, and Ethan's breath caught as the world seemed to narrow to that single point, every sound fading into the background while Lucas stilled completely, the question hitting him without warning, without preparation. For a second, just a second, Lucas did not answer, his gaze flickering up to Ethan, searching, demanding something that Ethan refused to give, and then back to Noah, the conflict written clearly across his face before he smoothed it over with visible effort. Lucas started, then stopped, exhaling slowly as if choosing each word mattered more than anything else. I do not know yet, he said finally, and the honesty in that answer, imperfect and incomplete, landed in a way Ethan had not expected, because there was no deflection, no control, just uncertainty, and it made everything more complicated than Ethan wanted it to be. Noah considered that for a moment, then nodded like it made perfect sense, because to him, things were simple. Either someone stayed or they did not, and he stepped back closer to Ethan without hesitation, anchoring himself again in the only certainty he had ever known. Ethan swallowed, the tightness in his chest growing sharper, because this was exactly what he had been trying to avoid, the slow, inevitable pull of connection forming in real time, and he could see it happening. Could see Lucas noticing every small detail, every similarity, every unspoken answer that Ethan had tried so hard to keep hidden. "We are leaving," Ethan said again, firmer this time, his hand resting protectively on Noah's shoulder, and this time he did not wait for permission, turning toward the exit with measured steps, forcing himself not to look back, because looking back would mean acknowledging that part of him was already slipping, already questioning the version of the past he had built his entire life around. But before he could reach the door, Lucas's voice followed him, lower, steadier, but carrying something that made Ethan stop despite himself. 3 years ago, Lucas said, and Ethan's spine stiffened instantly, every muscle going tight as the words caught up to him. "I woke up and you were gone." And that was enough. Enough to make Ethan turn sharply, disbelief flashing across his face before he could hide it, because that was not how it happened. That was not the story he remembered, and the certainty in Lucas's eyes told him this was not a lie. It was a truth that did not match his own, and that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant one of them had been living with the wrong version of the past this entire time. "That is not true," Ethan said immediately, the words slipping out before he could stop them, sharp and instinctive, because the version Lucas was describing did not match the memory that had kept him awake night after night, staring at the ceiling with a hollow ache in his chest, replaying that morning over and over until it became something solid, something he could survive. But now Lucas was standing there rewriting it with nothing more than a calm, steady voice, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Lucas did not react right away, did not push, did not raise his voice. He simply held Ethan's gaze with that same quiet intensity, like he was waiting for something deeper than denial, and the patience in that look made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he did not want to acknowledge. "I remember," Lucas said slowly, each word deliberate. "Waking up and the room was empty, your scent barely there, like you had already decided to disappear. Before I opened my eyes," and the way he said it, not accusing, not defensive, just certain, made Ethan's stomach twist, because that was not how he remembered it, not at all. And yet something in Lucas's tone felt too grounded to dismiss. "You left first," Ethan shot back, the words hitting harder now, fueled by years of bottled frustration. "You were gone before I woke up. You did not leave a note. You did not call. You did not even try." And the memories surged forward, disjointed and sharp. The cold emptiness of that room, the silence that followed, the way everything had felt unreal and irreversible all at once. Lucas's brow furrowed slightly, confusion breaking through his controlled expression, and that alone made Ethan hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, because this was not the reaction he expected, not guilt, not indifference, but something closer to disbelief. "That is not possible," Lucas said, quieter now, more to himself than to Ethan, as if he was piecing something together in real time. "I stayed until morning." And the certainty in his voice clashed violently with Ethan's memory, creating a fracture that neither of them seemed prepared to handle. Noah tugged lightly at Ethan's hand again, grounding him back in the present, and Ethan forced himself to focus, to breathe, because this was not the place to unravel, not in front of his son, not where everything could be seen so clearly. "It does not matter," Ethan said finally, the words heavier than he intended, because part of him knew that it did matter, that this difference in memory meant something larger, something unresolved, but he could not afford to chase that right now. 3 years passed. Lucas, 3 years where you were not here. And that was the truth he had built his life around. The one thing he could not let shift. Lucas's gaze flickered to Noah again, softer this time, more complicated. And when he looked back at Ethan, there was a new edge to his voice, not harsh, but firm in a way that felt immovable. "And yet you are telling me that child might be mine," he said. And the way he said might carried more weight than certainty ever could, because it meant he was still holding back, still choosing his words carefully. And that restraint made everything feel more real, more fragile. Ethan exhaled slowly, the fight draining just enough for something else to slip through, something quieter, more dangerous. "I did not tell you because I thought you chose to leave," he admitted, the truth finally breaking through the surface, and saying it out loud felt like reopening a wound he had spent years trying to close. "I was not going to chase someone who walked away from me." And Lucas's expression shifted again, something heavier settling in his eyes, something that looked almost like regret. But before Ethan could process it, before he could decide what it meant, Lucas stepped closer, just enough to close the distance that Ethan had tried so hard to maintain, his voice low but steady. "Then we have been living in the wrong story for 3 years." And that sentence landed harder than anything else, because it was not just about the past anymore, it was about everything that came after, everything Ethan thought he understood, and for the first time, he was not sure where the truth actually began. The words lingered between them, heavy and unresolved, and Ethan felt them settling into places he had kept locked for years, quiet corners of his mind where questions were not allowed to exist because answers would have required hope, and hope was something he had trained himself to live without. Noah shifted closer against his side, small fingers curling into the fabric of Ethan's shirt, grounding him again, reminding him what mattered now, what he had built on his own, piece by fragile piece, without anyone else to rely on. And that thought alone steadied him just enough to lift his chin and meet Lucas's gaze again, even as something inside him remained unsettled. "Maybe," Ethan said slowly, the word careful, measured, "but that does not change what happened after." And Lucas did not interrupt, did not argue. He simply listened, his expression unreadable but focused in a way that made it clear he was not walking away from this conversation, not this time. And that alone made Ethan's chest tighten. "I spent 3 years thinking you chose to leave," Ethan continued, his voice quieter now, not sharp, not defensive, just honest in a way that felt unfamiliar. "I built a life around that truth because I had no other option." And as he said it, he could feel the weight of those years pressing against him. The early mornings, the long nights, the constant balancing act of being everything Noah needed while carrying the quiet ache of something unfinished. Lucas's gaze softened, just slightly, the sharp edges dulling as he looked between Ethan and Noah again. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something that felt less like control and more like understanding. "Then we both lost 3 years we cannot get back," he said, and there was no accusation in it, just a simple, undeniable fact that settled heavily in the space between them. Noah looked up at Ethan, then at Lucas, his small face thoughtful as he processed the tension in the only way a child could, without the weight of the past, without the fear of what it meant. And then he spoke again, voice soft but clear, "Are you going to stay?" And the question shifted everything, because it was not directed at Ethan this time. It was directed at Lucas, simple and direct in a way that adults rarely allowed themselves to be, and Ethan felt his breath catch as he realized how much weight that single question carried. Lucas did not answer immediately, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, before he exhaled slowly, lowering himself again to meet Noah's eyes, making sure there was no distance between them when he spoke. "I would like to," he said, the words quiet but steady, and Ethan felt something twist in his chest at the honesty in that answer, because it was not a promise, not yet, but it was not empty either. It was something in between, something real, but Lucas continued, his gaze lifting briefly to Ethan before returning to Noah. I think your dad gets to decide that. And the way he said it, acknowledging Ethan without pushing, without demanding, made the tension shift again, softer this time, but no less complicated. Ethan swallowed, his pulse uneven, because this was not the confrontation he had prepared himself for. This was not anger or dismissal or indifference. This was something far more difficult to navigate, something that required him to question the certainty he had built his entire life around, and he hated how unsteady that made him feel. We are not deciding anything right now, Ethan said finally, his voice firm but not cold, because he needed space, needed time, needed something to hold on to before everything shifted too far too fast, and Lucas nodded once, accepting the boundary without argument, which somehow made it harder to maintain. Then tell me where you will be, Lucas said, calm, direct, so we can talk again. And the simplicity of the request made Ethan hesitate, because refusing would be easier, cleaner, safer, but Noah's small hand tightened in his. And when Ethan glanced down, he saw the quiet curiosity in his son's eyes, the unspoken question lingering there. And for the first time, Ethan realized this was not just his decision anymore. It was something bigger than him, something that would shape more than just his own life. And that realization made it impossible to walk away as easily as he once had. Ethan hesitated just long enough for Lucas to notice, and that alone made his chest tighten, because hesitation meant possibility, and possibility was exactly what he had spent 3 years avoiding. Noah's small hand shifted in his grip again, warm and steady, and Ethan looked down at him for a brief second, grounding himself in the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined his life since the day everything changed. Because no matter what Lucas said or how the past twisted into something uncertain, Noah was real, present, and needed stability more than anything else. We live on Maple Street, Ethan said finally, the words coming out before he could overthink them. And the moment they were spoken, he felt the shift, felt the invisible line he had drawn begin to blur, because giving Lucas that information meant opening a door he had kept firmly closed. Lucas nodded once, not reacting with triumph or relief, just accepting it with that same calm focus that had always made him impossible to read, and somehow that made it feel more serious, more permanent, like this was not a fleeting moment but the beginning of something neither of them could easily undo. I will come by tomorrow, Lucas said, his tone steady, not a question, not a demand, just a statement that assumed continuity, and Ethan almost argued, almost pushed back, but the words caught in his throat because part of him knew that refusing now would not actually end this. It would only delay it, and delay was no longer enough. Noah tilted his head, looking between them again with that quiet curiosity that never seemed to fade, and then he tugged lightly on Ethan's sleeve. Can he come for dinner? He asked, his voice hopeful in a way that made Ethan's chest ache unexpectedly, because children did not see complications, they saw presence or absence. And to Noah, this was simple. Someone knew who might stay. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, to say something firm and protective. But Lucas spoke first, his voice softer now, directed entirely at Noah. Only if your dad says it is okay. And the way he said it, respectful and measured, shifted something again, because it acknowledged Ethan without pressure, without stepping over him. And that restraint made it harder to refuse outright. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of both their gazes on him, one curious, one steady, and for a moment, he felt unbalanced in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in years, caught between the life he had built and the past that refused to stay buried. We will see, Ethan said finally, choosing the safest answer he could manage, one that did not promise but did not close the door either, and Noah seemed satisfied with that, his small smile returning as if that was enough for now. Lucas straightened, his attention lingering on Noah for one last second before returning to Ethan, and there was something quieter in his expression now, something less guarded, as if the tension between them had shifted into something more complex, something that could not be resolved in a single conversation. Tomorrow, Lucas repeated, and this time it felt less like a statement and more like a thread being placed between them, thin but unbreakable, and Ethan nodded once before he could stop himself, because refusing again would have required more certainty than he currently had. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Ethan felt the world settling back in motion around him. Cars passing, voices drifting, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything felt different, unstable in a way he could not quite define, because the version of the past he had relied on was no longer solid, and the future he had carefully planned now had a new variable he could not ignore. Noah squeezed his hand lightly, looking up at him with a small, thoughtful expression. "He looks like me," he said again, quieter this time, and Ethan swallowed, glancing back over his shoulder just once, catching a glimpse of Lucas still standing there, watching them leave, unmoving, like he had no intention of disappearing again. And that realization settled deep in Ethan's chest, heavy and impossible to dismiss, because this time, walking away might not be enough to keep the past from catching up to him. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though every street was the same, every turn familiar, but Ethan's hands stayed tight on the steering wheel, his grip just a little too firm as his thoughts looped endlessly, replaying every word Lucas had said, every look, every hesitation, and none of it fit cleanly into the version of the past he had relied on for so long. Noah sat quietly in the back seat, unusually thoughtful, his small sneakers tapping lightly against the seat as he stared out the window, and after a few minutes, he spoke again, his voice soft but steady. "He is not scary." And Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, because that was not what he had been worried about, not really. But hearing Noah say it made something inside him shift anyway. "I did not say he was," Ethan replied, keeping his tone even, but Noah shook his head slightly, still looking outside. "You hold my hand tighter when you are scared," he said simply, and the honesty of it landed heavier than anything Lucas had said earlier, because Noah noticed everything, even the things Ethan tried to hide. Ethan loosened his grip slightly, flexing his fingers on the wheel, forcing himself to relax, but the tension did not fully leave. It settled somewhere deeper, harder to reach, harder to control. When they pulled into their small driveway, the familiar sight of the house should have brought comfort, the chipped paint on the porch railing, the small wind chime by the door that always caught the breeze just right. But today it felt different, like something unseen had followed them home, something that would not stay outside no matter how tightly Ethan tried to close the door. Inside, everything was as it should be. Toys scattered neatly in the corner, a half-finished drawing on the kitchen table, the quiet hum of a life that had been carefully built to be enough, and Ethan moved through it on instinct, setting down his keys, helping Noah out of his jacket, guiding him through the small routines that had become their rhythm. But his mind was elsewhere, circling back to Lucas again and again. "Is he coming tomorrow?" Noah asked, climbing onto one of the kitchen chairs, his feet swinging slightly above the floor, and Ethan paused for just a second before answering, because the certainty in that question felt too close to a decision he had not fully made. "He said he would," Ethan replied, keeping his voice neutral, but Noah smiled at that, a small, bright expression that made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he could not easily ignore. "Okay," Noah said, as if that settled everything, as if the world was simple enough to accept new people without hesitation, and Ethan envied that simplicity more than he wanted to admit. Later, after dinner, after the dishes were done and the house had quieted, Ethan stood alone by the window, staring out into the dark street, his reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself think about that morning 3 years ago without immediately shutting it down. The memory coming back in fragments, the cold side of the bed, the silence, the absence that had felt final. But now there was doubt threading through it, small but persistent, because if Lucas had been telling the truth, then something had gone wrong in a way Ethan had never considered, something that had separated them without either of them understanding it at the time. The thought unsettled him, made everything feel less certain, less stable, and he pressed his hand lightly against the glass, grounding himself in the present, reminding himself that whatever the past held, he still had control over what happened next, or at least he needed to believe that he did. Behind him, soft footsteps padded across the floor, and Noah's voice drifted through the quiet, sleepy and calm. "Good night, Dad." And Ethan turned, forcing a small smile as he walked over, brushing a gentle hand through his son's hair. "Good night," he replied, his voice softer now, more certain, because no matter what changed, that part of his life remained constant, the one thing he would protect without hesitation. But as he turned off the lights and the house settled into silence, the thought returned, quiet but impossible to ignore, because tomorrow was no longer just another day. It was the moment everything would begin to shift, and Ethan was not sure he was ready for what that meant. Morning came too fast, thin sunlight slipping through the blinds in quiet stripes that stretched across the floor, and Ethan was already awake before the alarm could go off, staring at the ceiling with that same tight feeling in his chest that had followed him into sleep and refused to leave. He turned his head slightly, listening, catching the faint sound of Noah moving in the next room, the soft thud of small feet against the floor, and that familiar rhythm grounded him just enough to push himself out of bed, forcing his body into motion even while his thoughts stayed tangled somewhere between past and present. In the kitchen, everything felt routine at first, the hum of the coffee maker, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, the quiet normalcy of breakfast, but underneath it all was a tension that had not been there before, something waiting, something that made every second feel heavier than it should. "Is he coming today?" Noah asked, his voice bright despite the early hour, and Ethan paused mid-motion, the question landing exactly where he expected it to, and yet it still made his grip tighten slightly around the edge of the counter. "He said he would," Ethan replied, keeping his tone steady, but Noah smiled like that answer alone was enough, like the uncertainty did not exist, and for a moment Ethan wished he could see the world that way again, simple and unbroken. The hours moved slower after that, each minute stretching just enough to make Ethan aware of it, aware of the time passing, aware of the inevitable moment drawing closer, and he found himself checking the clock more often than he wanted to admit, his focus slipping even during the most basic tasks, because no matter how much he tried to push it aside, the thought of Lucas standing at his door again refused to leave. When the knock finally came, it was softer than Ethan expected, just 3 quiet taps against the wood, but it still sent a sharp jolt through him, his breath catching for half a second before he forced himself to move. Each step toward the door measured, controlled, even as his pulse refused to settle. Noah was already on his feet, quick and eager, his small form darting past Ethan before he could stop him, reaching the door first and looking back with that same open curiosity. "I will get it," he said, and Ethan's hand lifted instinctively, a reflex he could not quite suppress. But it stopped midair because this was happening whether he was ready or not. The door opened, and there he was again. Lucas Hale, standing on the porch like he had always known exactly where to find them, his presence filling the space without effort, and for a brief second, no one spoke, the moment stretching as all 3 of them simply existed in the same frame, something unfamiliar and unfinished settling between them. Lucas's gaze moved first, landing on Noah with that same quiet intensity, but this time there was something softer beneath it, something less guarded, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the tension from the day before. "Good morning," he said, directed entirely at the child, and Noah beamed in response, stepping back to let him in without hesitation, as if that decision had already been made in his mind long before today. Ethan remained where he was, just a few steps away, watching, measuring, every sense alert as Lucas crossed the threshold into the space Ethan had built without him. And the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like something had been added that changed the balance of everything around it. "You came," Noah said simply, looking up at Lucas with that same unfiltered honesty. And Lucas nodded once, his expression steady. "I said I would," he replied, and the weight of that promise, simple as it was, landed differently this time, because Ethan heard it too, felt it settle somewhere deeper than he was ready to acknowledge. And as the door closed behind Lucas, the quiet certainty of it lingered in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore, because now that he was here, nothing would remain the same. The air inside the house shifted the moment Lucas stepped in, subtle but unmistakable, like the space itself was adjusting to his presence, and Ethan felt it immediately, a quiet tension settling under his skin as he watched Lucas take in the room without moving too far, his gaze flickering across the small details that made up their life, the worn couch, the scattered toys, the drawings taped unevenly to the wall, each one a piece of something Ethan had built alone. Noah moved closer to Lucas. Without hesitation, curiosity pulling him forward in small, confident steps, and Ethan's chest tightened slightly at how natural it looked, how easily the distance between them closed when Ethan had spent years making sure that space stayed empty. "Do you want to see my room?" Noah asked, his voice bright, already turning as if the answer did not matter because in his mind, it had already been decided, and Lucas hesitated just for a second, his eyes flicking toward Ethan, not asking permission directly but acknowledging him in a way that made Ethan pause, because it was careful, intentional, nothing like the certainty he remembered from before. Ethan gave a small nod before he could stop himself, the motion subtle but enough, and Lucas followed Noah down the short hallway, his steps measured, as if he was aware that every movement mattered. Here, Ethan stayed where he was for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, grounding himself as he listened to the faint sounds of their voices drifting from the other room. Noah's excited tone mixed with Lucas's lower, quieter responses, and something about it felt unreal, like a scene he had never allowed himself to imagine playing out right in front of him. When Ethan finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, each step pulling him closer to a reality he was not sure how to handle. And he stopped just outside the doorway, watching without interrupting, because what he saw made it difficult to look away. Noah stood in the middle of the room, pointing out small things with animated gestures, the drawings, the toys, the little details that made up his world, and Lucas listened, really listened, his focus entirely on the child, his posture relaxed in a way Ethan had never seen before, like he was letting something unfamiliar settle into place. "This is my favorite," Noah said, holding up a crayon drawing with uneven lines and bright colors, and Lucas took it carefully, like it was something fragile, his fingers brushing the paper lightly as he studied it with an attention that felt too genuine to dismiss. "You made this?" Lucas asked, his voice softer than Ethan expected, and Noah nodded proudly. "It is us," he said, pointing to 3 figures drawn side by side, one smaller, 2 taller, and Ethan felt his breath catch slightly at the simplicity of it, the way Noah had filled in a space that had never been explained to him, had never been defined. Lucas's expression shifted as he looked at the drawing, something deeper settling in his gaze, something that made him go still for just a second too long, and then he glanced toward the doorway, toward Ethan, their eyes meeting across the small space, and in that moment, nothing needed to be said because the weight of it was already there, clear and undeniable. "You drew 3, Lucas said quietly, his attention returning to Noah, but there was something different in his voice now, something more careful, more aware, and Noah shrugged slightly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because there are 3 of us," he replied, and the certainty in that statement landed heavier than anything else, because it was not a question, not a hope, just a simple truth from Noah's perspective, and Ethan felt something shift again, something he could not easily push aside this time. Lucas did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on the drawing before lowering it carefully, his fingers tightening just slightly around the edge as if he was holding on to more than just paper. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried something new, something that had not been there before. "Then I have a lot to learn," he said, and the quiet sincerity in those words made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he was not prepared for, because this was no longer just about the past. It was about what came next, and for the first time, Ethan could not tell if he was more afraid of Lucas staying or leaving again. The room felt smaller than it had before, not because anything had physically changed, but because the space between them had filled with something heavier, something that refused to be ignored, and Ethan found himself stepping fully into the doorway now, no longer content to observe from a distance, because what was happening in front of him was no longer something he could pretend did not involve him. Lucas set the drawing down carefully on the small desk, his movements deliberate, controlled. But there was a subtle tension in his shoulders now, a weight settling into him as he processed something deeper than simple curiosity. And when he turned to face Ethan, the shift in his expression was unmistakable, quieter, but more certain. "We need to talk," Lucas said, his voice low enough that Noah would not immediately pick up on the seriousness behind it. and Ethan felt his chest tighten again. Because those words carried more weight now than they had the day before, heavier with context, heavier with possibility. Noah looked between them, sensing the change even if he could not fully understand it, and Ethan forced a small smile, stepping forward and resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Why do not you go pick out a book for later?" he said, softly, and Noah hesitated for a moment before nodding, slipping past them and moving back toward the living room, leaving a quiet space behind that felt suddenly too still. The moment Noah was out of sight, the air shifted again, the careful balance gone, replaced by something more direct, more unavoidable, and Ethan crossed his arms loosely, not defensive, but steadying himself. "Say what you need to say," he said, keeping his voice even despite the tension building under his skin. Lucas did not rush, did not fill the silence immediately. He simply held Ethan's gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring his words, and then he spoke. "I ran a timeline last night," he said, and the phrasing made Ethan blink slightly, because it was so precise, so deliberate. "If he is 3, then that places his birth exactly where I think it does." And the clarity in his voice made it impossible to misunderstand what he was implying, and Ethan's stomach tightened in response. "You think?" Ethan echoed, a slight edge returning to his tone, because he needed something to push against, something to hold on to, and Lucas's gaze did not waver. "I am not guessing," he replied calmly. "I am telling you that the timing aligns." And the certainty in those words pressed against Ethan's chest in a way that made it hard to breathe, because this was no longer just an emotional question. It was something grounded, something that could be proven, something that could not be ignored. Ethan looked away briefly, his eyes landing on the small details of the room, the bed, the scattered toys, the life he had built without needing confirmation from anyone else. And he exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself before looking back. "Even if that is true," he said, quieter now, "it does not change the fact that I have been the only one here." And Lucas's expression softened again, just slightly, but there was something firm underneath it, something that did not bend. "I am not trying to take that away from you," he said, and the sincerity in his tone made Ethan pause, because there was no challenge in it, no attempt to diminish what Ethan had done, only acknowledgement, and that made it harder to argue against. "Then what are you trying to do?" Ethan asked, the question coming out more honest than he intended, and Lucas took a small step closer, not enough to invade space, but enough to close the distance slightly, his voice lowering just enough to carry weight without raising volume. "I am trying to understand what was taken from both of us," he said, and that landed differently, because it shifted the perspective, made it less about blame and more about something unresolved, something that had been interrupted without either of them realizing it at the time. Ethan felt his pulse quicken slightly, because that idea, that something had been taken rather than lost, was not something he had allowed himself to consider before, and it unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. From the other room, Noah's voice drifted back, light and unaware, humming softly to himself, and that simple sound grounded Ethan again, pulling him back to what mattered most. But it did not erase the weight of what Lucas had said, and as Ethan met Lucas's gaze once more, he realized this conversation was no longer just about whether Lucas would stay. It was about uncovering a truth neither of them fully understood yet, and that made everything ahead feel uncertain in a way he could not control. The words settled between them like something fragile but undeniable, and Ethan felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides, because this was no longer just about a misunderstanding or a missing explanation. It was something deeper, something that suggested their past had been altered in a way neither of them had fully seen, and that realization made his chest tighten with a quiet, unfamiliar unease. He exhaled slowly, shifting his weight slightly as his gaze dropped for a brief second, collecting his thoughts before looking back at Lucas again, because he could not afford to let uncertainty take over completely. Not when Noah was just a few steps away in the next room, humming softly like nothing in the world had changed. "You were saying something took those 3 years from us," Ethan said, his voice measured, careful, testing the shape of the idea out loud, and Lucas nodded once, not hesitating this time, his expression steady in a way that made it clear he had already been turning this over in his mind long before stepping into this house again. I am saying something interrupted what should have happened, Lucas replied, his tone calm but grounded, and Ethan felt a flicker of frustration rise despite himself, because that kind of answer opened more questions than it resolved, and questions were dangerous when they touched something this personal, this deeply rooted. That does not explain why neither of us tried to find the other, Ethan pointed out, his voice tightening slightly as he crossed his arms again, not defensively, but as if bracing himself against something he could not yet define, and Lucas's gaze shifted just briefly, like that question hit a place he had not fully explored either. I did, Lucas said after a moment, quieter now, and the simplicity of that statement made Ethan freeze for just a second, his breath catching, before he could control it, because that was not something he had expected to hear, not something that fit into the version of events he had lived with for so long. I looked for you, Lucas continued, his voice steady but carrying a subtle weight. But everything led nowhere, like you had disappeared completely. And Ethan's mind raced immediately, searching for answers, for inconsistencies, for something that would make this make sense, because he had not hidden, not really, he had stayed in the same city, built a life that was quiet but visible, and the idea that Lucas could not find him did not align with reality as Ethan understood it. That does not make sense, Ethan said, the words coming out sharper now, because this was crossing into something that challenged more than just memory. It challenged fact, and Lucas did not argue, did not push back immediately. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the contradiction instead of dismissing it. I know, Lucas said, and there was something in his tone that shifted the tension again, something less certain, more searching, which is why I am here now. And that answer landed differently, because it was not just about the past anymore. It was about what Lucas was choosing to do with what he knew now, what he suspected, and Ethan felt that realization settle deeper than anything else had so far. From the other room, Noah's laughter broke through the quiet, light and unburdened, and it grounded Ethan instantly, pulling him back from the edge of uncertainty just enough to remind him what mattered most. Because no matter what truth they uncovered, no matter what had been lost or taken, Noah was here, real and present, and needed stability above all else. Ethan uncrossed his arms slowly, his posture shifting just slightly as he looked at Lucas again, this time with less resistance and more cautious consideration, because dismissing him outright was no longer as simple as it had been before. If what you are saying is true, Ethan said carefully, choosing each word with intention, then we need more than assumptions. And Lucas nodded immediately, as if he had been expecting that response, his expression sharpening with quiet focus. Agreed, he replied, and there was something firm in that agreement, something that suggested he was already prepared for what came next. The air between them shifted again, not lighter, not easier, but clearer in a way that felt both relieving and unsettling at the same time. Because this was no longer just a confrontation or a question of presence. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that required both of them to face a past that was no longer as certain as they had believed. And as Ethan stood there, listening to the quiet sounds of Noah in the next room and the steady presence of Lucas in front of him, he realized that whatever truth they uncovered next would not just change how they saw each other. It would change everything they thought they knew about the life they had already lived. The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable, like something had settled into place even though nothing had been resolved yet. And Ethan could feel it in the way his breathing had steadied just slightly, in the way Lucas no longer felt like an intruder, but not quite like he belonged either, suspended somewhere in between, and that uncertainty made everything feel fragile in a way Ethan could not ignore. He glanced toward the living room where Noah's quiet humming continued, soft and consistent, a small anchor that kept him grounded while everything else seemed to blur at the edges. And when he looked back at Lucas, there was a different kind of focus in his gaze now, less guarded, more deliberate, like he had decided to face whatever came next without stepping back. If we are going to figure this out, Ethan said slowly, choosing his words with care, then we start with what we actually remember. And Lucas nodded immediately, the response quick but not rushed, as if he had already been thinking along the same lines. Then we start with that morning, Lucas replied, his voice even, and Ethan felt a flicker of tension return at the mention of it, because that memory had been the foundation of everything that followed. the point where his life had split into before and after. I remember waking up cold, Ethan said, his gaze dropping briefly as the image surfaced again, clearer now, but also more uncertain than it had ever been. The room felt empty, like it had already been empty for a while, and he paused, trying to hold on to the details without letting them slip away under the weight of doubt. There was no note, no message, nothing. And when he looked back up, Lucas was watching him closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening with an intensity that made it hard to look away. I remember the opposite, Lucas said after a moment, his tone steady but quieter now. I woke up and you were gone, but it did not feel like you had been gone long. And that difference, small but critical, settled between them again, highlighting the gap in their memories in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly as he considered it, because if both of them were telling the truth, then something in between had been altered, something neither of them had seen, and that realization sent a quiet unease through him. What if neither of us left first? Ethan said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke it, uncertain but persistent. What if something happened in between that we do not remember? And Lucas's expression sharpened slightly at that, not surprised, but recognizing the possibility as something real rather than abstract. Then we need to find out what, Lucas replied, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice now, something grounded and focused, like he had already accepted that this was no longer just about emotions or assumptions. It was something that required answers. Ethan exhaled softly, feeling the weight of that settle deeper into his chest, because finding out meant digging into something he had avoided for years, something he had convinced himself did not matter anymore, and yet now it felt impossible to ignore. From the other room, Noah's footsteps approached again, light and quick, and a moment later he appeared in the doorway, holding a book with both hands, his expression bright and unaware of the shift that had just taken place. I found it, Noah said proudly, stepping closer without hesitation, and Ethan's gaze softened. Immediately as he looked down at him, the tension easing just enough to remind him what he needed to protect in all of this. Lucas crouched slightly again, meeting Noah at eye level without being asked, his posture natural now in a way it had not been before, and Ethan noticed it, the ease that was starting to form, slow but steady. Will you read with us? Noah asked, looking between them, his question simple but carrying a weight that neither adult could ignore, and Ethan felt his chest tighten again, because this was no longer just about the past or even the truth they were trying to uncover. It was about what they chose to do in the present. In moments like this, Lucas glanced up at Ethan briefly, not asking, but acknowledging him again. And Ethan hesitated for just a second before nodding, because saying no felt harder than saying yes in that moment. And as they moved toward the living room together, the space between them shifting once more, Ethan realized that whatever answers they found would not just explain the past, they would shape everything that came next, and he was not sure yet if he was ready for how much could change. The story began with confusion, but it settled into something quieter, something far more dangerous, because as Ethan sat on the couch with Noah pressed against his side and Lucas just a few inches away, reading a simple children's book in a steady, careful voice, he realized this was no longer about what had happened 3 years ago. It was about what was happening now, in real time, in a space that used to belong only to him and his son. Noah leaned comfortably between them, his small head tilting slightly as he followed along, completely at ease in a moment that Ethan still could not fully process. And every time Lucas turned a page, every time his voice softened on a certain word, Ethan felt something shift again, something subtle but persistent, like a crack forming in a wall he had spent years building. When the story ended, Noah let out a satisfied breath, curling slightly into Ethan's side before looking up at Lucas with quiet expectation. Will you come back tomorrow too? He asked, and the question hung there, simple but heavy, because it carried the kind of hope Ethan had spent years protecting him from. And Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against Noah's shoulder without meaning to, the instinct to shield rising again even as he knew it might not be enough this time. Lucas did not answer immediately, and for a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face again, not hesitation, but awareness, like he understood the weight behind the question. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but softer than before. "If your dad allows it," he said. And the respect in that answer landed in a way Ethan could not ignore, because it placed the decision back where it belonged without stepping away from the possibility. Noah seemed satisfied with that, his attention already drifting as the moment settled. But Ethan could feel the shift more clearly now, the quiet expectation that had formed, the space that had been opened without him fully choosing it. And it made his chest tighten in a way that was no longer just fear, but something more complicated, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. After Noah was tucked into bed, his breathing slow and even as sleep took over, Ethan stepped quietly into the hallway, the house dim and still, and Lucas was there, standing near the window just as he had the night before. But this time he was not looking outside. He was waiting, as if he already knew Ethan would come. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching but not uncomfortable, just full, like it held everything they had not yet said. And then Ethan exhaled slowly, breaking it first. "This cannot be temporary," he said, his voice low but firm, because that was the truth he needed to anchor himself to, the one condition he could not compromise. And Lucas met his gaze without hesitation, something steady and unwavering settling in his expression. "It is not," Lucas replied, and there was no doubt in his voice this time, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty that felt heavier than any promise, because it was not offered lightly. It was stated as something he intended to prove. Ethan studied him for a moment longer, searching for any sign that this would fall apart the way it had before, but what he found instead was something different, something grounded, something that did not match the version of Lucas he had held on to for 3 years, and that difference made it harder to turn away. "Then we find out what really happened," Ethan said finally, the decision settling into place even as it brought a new kind of uncertainty with it. And Lucas nodded once, the agreement immediate, as if this had always been the direction they were moving toward. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt the same, because something had changed, something that could not be undone. And as Ethan stood there, aware of Lucas's presence just a few feet away and Noah sleeping peacefully in the next room, he realized this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, something that would force them both to confront the truth of their past and the shape of their future. And for the first time, he was not sure if he was more afraid of what they would find or what it would mean if they finally did.